The slow death of the male soul. How female attention became modern man's poison. Jake checked his phone for the 47th time that hour, his heart racing as he saw 3 new notifications from dating apps, but none from Sarah, the woman whose single text could make or break his entire day. At 28 years old, this successful marketing executive had reduced himself to a dopamine-addicted shell of a man, constantly seeking validation from women who barely knew his last name, let alone understood his deepest dreams and fears. What Jake didn't realize was that he was living out a philosophical nightmare that Søren Kierkegaard warned about over 150 years ago. The complete abandonment of authentic selfhood in pursuit of external validation, particularly from the opposite sex. Kierkegaard understood something that our modern culture refuses to acknowledge. When a man makes female attention the center of his existence, he doesn't just lose his dignity, he loses his very soul. The Danish philosopher wrote extensively about what he called the aesthetic stage of existence, a way of living focused entirely on immediate pleasure, external validation, and the desperate avoidance of authentic self-confrontation. Today's men, drowning in an ocean of dating apps, social media likes, and the constant availability of female attention, have become trapped in this very stage, mistaking the pursuit of women for the pursuit of meaning. How many of you have ever felt like your entire mood and self-worth depended on whether a woman texted you back or not? Jake's descent into this philosophical hell began innocently enough, like it does for millions of modern men. In college, he was focused, driven, working toward his goals, with the kind of single-minded determination that builds character and creates genuine accomplishment. He had hobbies he was passionate about, friends he genuinely enjoyed spending time with, and a clear vision of the man he wanted to become. But then social media exploded. Dating apps became ubiquitous, and suddenly, Jake found himself with unprecedented access to female attention and unprecedented competition for it. What should have been a tool for connection became a slot machine of validation, with each swipe, each match, each response triggering the same neurochemical reward system that keeps gamblers pulling levers until they've lost everything they own. Kierkegaard warned that when we live in what he called the immediate, constantly seeking external stimulation and validation, we become incapable of the deep self-reflection necessary for authentic existence. Jake had become exactly this kind of person, constantly refreshing his apps, constantly crafting the perfect response, constantly wondering what women thought of him instead of developing his own thoughts about what kind of life he wanted to build. The insidious nature of this modern trap is that it masquerades as confidence and social success. Jake's Instagram was filled with photos of him at parties, surrounded by attractive women, appearing to live the kind of lifestyle that society tells us successful men should want. But Kierkegaard understood that external appearances often mask internal emptiness, that the man who needs constant validation from others is actually the most insecure person in the room. What had once been Jake's authentic interests, his love of reading philosophy, his passion for rock climbing, his dreams of starting his own business, gradually took a back seat to his obsession with female attention. He began choosing activities not based on what genuinely excited him, but on what would make for good social media content that might attract women. His authentic self was slowly being suffocated by his performed self. Kierkegaard wrote about the concept of the crowd versus the individual, how society pressures us to conform to external expectations rather than developing our own internal compass. Modern dating culture has weaponized this concept, turning men into performers who compete for female approval, rather than individuals who develop themselves for their own growth and satisfaction. Jake found himself constantly comparing his success with women to other men's apparent success, creating a competitive dynamic that poisoned his friendships and filled him with either arrogance when he was winning or despair when he felt he was falling behind. The irony that Kierkegaard would have appreciated is that this constant external focus made Jake less attractive, not more. Desperate energy repels the very thing it seeks to attract. The philosopher understood that authentic confidence comes from internal alignment, from knowing who you are, what you stand for, and what you're building with your life regardless of external circumstances. But Jake had become so addicted to female validation that he had lost touch with his own values, his own goals, his own sense of purpose beyond attracting women. Have you ever realized that you've changed fundamental parts of your personality just to appeal to someone else's preferences? The breaking point came when Jake realized he couldn't remember the last time he had spent a full day without checking his dating apps or wondering what some woman thought about his latest social media post. He had become what Kierkegaard would call a slave to immediacy, unable to exist peacefully in his own company, constantly needing external stimulation to feel alive. The Danish philosopher believed that this kind of existence represents a form of spiritual death, the death of the authentic self in service of the false self that performs for others' approval. Jake had achieved career success, maintained his fitness, acquired all the external markers of an attractive modern man, but he had lost the most important thing, his connection to his own authentic desires and values. Kierkegaard wrote extensively about anxiety as a fundamental part of human existence, not something to be avoided, but something to be embraced as a sign that we're confronting authentic choices about who we want to become. But Jake, like so many modern men, had learned to use female attention as a drug to numb this necessary anxiety, avoiding the difficult but essential work of self-development. The constant availability of female attention through technology had created what Kierkegaard would recognize as a false solution to existential emptiness. Instead of doing the hard work of building a meaningful life, Jake had become addicted to the quick dopamine hits of matches, likes, and responses, mistaking stimulation for satisfaction, confusing external validation with internal peace. The poor philosopher understood that when we make other people responsible for our sense of worth and meaning, we become incapable of genuine love, because genuine love requires two complete individuals choosing to share their lives, not two incomplete people trying to complete each other through mutual validation. Jake's relationships had become increasingly shallow and unstable because he approached them from a position of need rather than strength, seeking to extract validation rather than to share authentic connection. Women could sense his desperation, his lack of internal anchor, his willingness to change himself to gain their approval, and this very flexibility made him ultimately unattractive to anyone worth attracting. The wake-up call came when Jake met Emma, a woman who seemed different from the others, more substantive, more interested in real conversation, more focused on building something meaningful rather than just having fun. But when she began to show genuine interest in who he was beneath his carefully crafted persona, Jake realized with horror that he no longer knew the answer to that question. Who was he when he wasn't performing for female attention? What did he actually want out of life beyond the validation of attractive women? What were his genuine interests, values, and goals when stripped of their utility as conversation starters or Instagram content? Jake faced the existential crisis that Kierkegaard believed was necessary for authentic development, the terrifying but liberating realization that he had been living someone else's life. Kierkegaard taught that authentic existence requires what he called the leap of faith, not necessarily religious faith, but the courage to commit to a way of being without external guarantees, to choose who you want to become based on internal conviction rather than external validation. For Jake, this meant the terrifying prospect of rebuilding his life around his own values rather than women's approval. The withdrawal was more difficult than Jake had anticipated. Like any addiction, his dependence on female attention had physical and psychological components. He experienced genuine anxiety when he deleted his dating apps, real depression when he stopped checking his social media for women's responses to his posts. His nervous system had become accustomed to the constant stimulation of potential romantic validation. But Kierkegaard understood that this discomfort was necessary for growth, that the anxiety of authentic choice is far superior to the false peace of external validation. Jake began to rediscover interests and activities that he had abandoned in his pursuit of female attention. He started reading again, not to have something impressive to say on dates, but because ideas genuinely excited him. He returned to rock climbing, not as content for social media, but as a way of challenging himself and experiencing the kind of pure focus that comes from engaging with something demanding and beautiful. He began working on his business ideas again, not to impress women with his ambition, but because he genuinely wanted to create something valuable in the world. The transformation wasn't immediate or linear. Jake frequently felt the pull to return to his apps, to seek the easy validation that had become his drug of choice. But gradually, as he rebuilt his relationship with himself, he began to experience something he had forgotten was possible: the deep satisfaction that comes from living according to your own values rather than others' expectations. What would happen to your life if you suddenly couldn't seek validation from the opposite sex for an entire year? Kierkegaard wrote about 3 stages of human development: the aesthetic, living for immediate pleasure and external validation; the ethical, living according to universal principles and social roles; and the religious, living according to one's authentic calling regardless of external circumstances. Jake's journey was from the aesthetic to something approaching the religious stage, not in a necessarily spiritual sense, but in the sense of finding meaning beyond social approval. As Jake reconnected with his authentic self, something remarkable happened in his relationships with women. They improved dramatically. When he stopped desperately seeking female attention, when he began approaching women from a position of genuine interest rather than need, when he had something substantial to offer because he was building a meaningful life, he became genuinely attractive in a way that all his previous performance had never achieved. The paradox that Kierkegaard would have appreciated is that the man who doesn't need female validation is the man who most easily receives it, because he approaches relationships from strength rather than weakness, from abundance rather than scarcity, from genuine interest rather than desperate need. Jake learned that the highest form of attraction isn't physical appearance or social status or wealth. It's the quiet confidence that comes from knowing who you are and what you're building with your life, regardless of external circumstances. This kind of internal peace and purpose is magnetic because it's so rare in a world full of people seeking validation from others. But more importantly, Jake discovered that the goal isn't to become attractive to women, it's to become authentic to yourself. The man who builds his life around his own values and vision will naturally attract people who appreciate those qualities, while the man who shapes himself according to others' preferences will only attract people who are interested in the performance rather than the person. Kierkegaard believed that the highest human achievement is what he called becoming a self, not just accepting who you happen to be, but consciously choosing who you want to become based on your deepest values and convictions. This process requires the courage to disappoint people, to be misunderstood, to choose authenticity over approval. For modern men drowning in female attention, this philosophical framework offers a path to freedom, not freedom from women, but freedom from the desperate need for their validation that prevents genuine connection and authentic self-development. The goal isn't to become indifferent to women, but to become indifferent to their opinion of you when that opinion conflicts with your authentic values. Jake's story represents the possibility that Kierkegaard saw for all human beings: the transformation from external dependence to internal independence, from performed identity to authentic selfhood, from the anxiety of seeking approval to the peace of self-acceptance. The philosopher understood that this journey is ongoing, not a destination, but a way of traveling. Even now, Jake sometimes feels the old pull toward external validation, the temptation to shape his choices around others' preferences rather than his own values. But he has developed what Kierkegaard called the strength to be alone, the ability to find meaning and purpose in his own company, to be his own source of validation and direction. This doesn't mean isolation or rejection of relationships. It means approaching relationships from wholeness rather than neediness, offering something substantial rather than seeking to extract validation. The man who has learned to be complete on his own becomes capable of genuine partnership because he's not trying to use the relationship to fill psychological voids. The broader implication of Jake's journey and Kierkegaard's philosophy is that modern culture's emphasis on external validation, particularly romantic and sexual validation, is creating a generation of men who are successful in external terms, but empty in internal terms. They have mastered the art of performance, but lost touch with the substance of authentic existence. The solution isn't to reject women or relationships, but to build them on a foundation of self-knowledge and authentic purpose, rather than desperate need and external validation. The man who knows who he is and what he's building with his life can offer a woman genuine partnership rather than demanding that she complete him or validate his worth. Kierkegaard's ultimate message was about the courage required for authentic existence, the willingness to be yourself even when others don't understand or approve, the strength to choose your own path even when it leads through loneliness and uncertainty, the faith to believe that authenticity is more valuable than approval. If this resonates with your own struggle, if you've recognized yourself in Jake's journey from authentic self to validation-seeking performer, don't waste this moment of clarity. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, someone who's lost himself in the pursuit of others' approval. Subscribe to join a community of men committed to authentic existence rather than external validation. Like this video if you believe that genuine self-development is more important than social media metrics. The path forward requires what Kierkegaard called passionate intensity, not the passion of desperate seeking, but the passion of authentic commitment to your own development and values. It means making choices based on who you want to become, rather than who others want you to be. Building a life that reflects your deepest convictions, rather than the latest trends in what's attractive or impressive. Your worth is not determined by female attention, social media metrics, or external validation of any kind. Your value comes from your commitment to authentic existence, your willingness to grow and develop according to your own vision, your courage to be yourself in a world that constantly pressures you to be someone else. The modern epidemic of male validation seeking isn't just a personal problem. It's a philosophical crisis that requires philosophical solutions. Kierkegaard's framework offers a way forward. The recognition that authentic existence requires the courage to disappoint others in service of remaining true to yourself. This isn't about becoming indifferent to relationships or dismissive of women. It's about approaching them from a position of strength rather than need, offering something valuable rather than seeking to extract validation. The man who has learned to validate himself becomes capable of genuine love because he's not using relationships to fill psychological voids. The slow death that Kierkegaard warned about, the death of the authentic self in service of external approval, is reversible. But it requires the kind of philosophical courage that most people avoid, because it's easier to seek validation than to build genuine worth, easier to perform for others than to discover who you really are. Jake's transformation from validation-addicted performer to authentically grounded man represents the possibility that exists for every man willing to do the difficult work of self-development. The goal isn't to become impressive to others, it's to become impressive to yourself, to build a life that you're proud of regardless of external recognition. The female attention that once seemed like the solution to all of life's problems reveals itself to be just another form of avoidance, a way of escaping the necessary work of building authentic character, developing genuine skills, and creating meaningful purpose. When you no longer need external validation to feel complete, you become capable of the kind of relationships that actually add value to your life, rather than simply filling psychological gaps. This is the liberation that Kierkegaard envisioned, not freedom from connection, but freedom within connection. The ability to love and be loved without losing yourself in the process. The man who has learned to be his own source of validation becomes capable of offering others the gift of genuine acceptance rather than demanding that they complete him. Your authentic self, the person you are when you're not performing for anyone else's approval, is worth more than all the external validation you could ever accumulate. The journey back to that self is difficult but necessary, challenging but ultimately liberating. The alternative is the slow death of everything that makes you uniquely valuable, the gradual dissolution of your authentic identity in the acid of constant approval seeking. Choose authenticity over approval. Choose self-development over external validation, Choose the difficult path of becoming yourself over the easy path of becoming what others want you to be. This choice, repeated daily in small decisions and major life directions, is what transforms boys into men and performers into authentic human beings. The woman who will truly appreciate you is waiting not for your performance, but for your authenticity. But first you must rediscover that authenticity yourself.